Guru Bama Sada Ho Ye Ye Na Sha Bama Geza Dombola Yamzam Joko Muja Bama Joni Jisa Jang Koda Kando Mambo Kiji Jisa Dadu Ji Shinje Labja Shasa Guru Bama Sada Ho Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Sada Oma Hum Banzar Guru Bama Oma Hum Banzarangara Bama Sada Oma Hum Banzarangara Bama Sada Oma Hum Banzarangara Bama Sada Oma Hum Banzarangara Sada Oma Hum Banzarangara Bama 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 Sada Ho Jila Da Jang Sora Da Be Da So Gang Da Nipi Sabjo Nadang Warmbon Dabzo Jewa Rajin Beram Zata Sora Chumdun Dim Gombo Jang Horang La Jang Za Lo Ganga Lo Tu Dumye Jang Jang Da Nanda Rasa Jinye Dunga Janja Zubja Nije Dagara Lawamza Kanda Jimbi Zura Maru Manda Dungara Jisa Dozo Kanla Vaji Darje Yanla Tuje Yanda Dudara Jejo Nyumo Nyalo Leje Jato Chamza Maru Maze Dungara Nyaga Jinye Chamza Raja Dune Daja Sabjin Dazo Yunda Lezo Jati Dao Chadra Chadam Jani Jantin Dalum Janwara Yang Lan Dada Umara Baza Narda 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 Nardo Umara Baza 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 Nardo Umara Bazanada, Umara Bazanada, Umara Bazanada, Umara Bazanada, Umara Bazan, Umara Bazanada, Sidana Jiji, Jero, Waziriki, Dalo, Dama, Mambara, Sani, Quadon, Damju, Jean Le Tomba, Ubi Nova, Geta, Soro, Nyaji, Jimbo, Zodan, Yumeja, Zone, Molon, Jimbo, Nadiat. Bakara Dangam Zandu Sharma Do Tomba Diji Janla Shansar Lo Oya Tanita Teranga Sundana Tani Porika Tani Pandan Nambata Tani Nashok Mata Tani Jargri Tani Mambos Limdik Tani Samala Tomar Tani Gomo Dela Joyin.
Tonight we have in our audience Tibetans and Westerners and Chinese. Firstly, I'd like to say good evening to everybody.
Tani ngatu terang lakang di nang la tani bor gyar tani nafshok mo tani tani mangboz nyam tan zomni tani chama tani tambi chu nyamba tani tang tani ngarang rang la yang tani da tamji bola tani tambi chu shajje tani korku tani shongwala tani pe sim gabo shongsong.
I'm extremely pleased and extremely happy to have the chance to give a teaching on the Dharma here to the audience, which is comprised of Tibetans and Chinese and Westerners all gathering here together.
Tani ngarang so tambi chu toni shanana tani yarik zeyan data porik zeyan data tani 지금 넙쇼고 뭐지한다 tani 그 머르크군요 예와는 tani 지금 가게요 말이
when we're talking about the Dharma, then saying Chinese or Westerner or Tibetan, there is no need to make these distinctions between different ethnicities or peoples.
tani 지금 머르 가로제한다 머르 낙보제한다 머르 세로제한다 tani 그 tani 또 머직 그 돈이 예와양 요 말이
Similarly, there's no need to make distinctions or to discriminate between people who are white or black or yellow.
tani 가서 잠발한 그 샤르쇼제하다 넙쇼제하다 tani 그 예와양 또 담비 추 돈이잖아 지지요 말이
And likewise, no need to make distinctions between people who are from the east and those who are from the west.
tani 아메리카 야르크제한다 tani 지 야르크 잠바제한다 tani 야르크 야르섬 그 예와양 또 델라 지지요 말이 담비 춘데라
And from the point of view of the Dharma, similarly, no point in making distinctions in terms of the countries that people come from, in terms of national borders.
다 tani 인디 가서 담비 추니 가서 tani 지다 먼남지 지더니 더 샤쇼다 너쇼고 예와 머르거 예와 머르그 세로다 나포 가로지 바텐디가 예와 텐디가 예와 망보 우스가 수시오 텐디가 예와 망보 수시오 때 tani 가서 담비 추고 예와 때 상마 매바시니 때 추고 돈이 다 텐디 시작이요 그래 남바 춘디 돈이
So in terms of Dharma, it's important that we don't make these distinctions and bring these distinctions into the Dharma, these distinctions between ethnicities and nationalities and this people and that people.
tani sanje shatyata pa chude thomar jagar la tani shongwe nerkamna tani jagar ka nangla samlo tangna murg je yewate halepa ga tarim ga yewate halepa ga ti kaps sarota tani yewate so parla tani tin thapsut 대양 하정은 용장 된디 체위 강 된디 지리스
When Buddhism arose in India, they had a very clear differentiation between, the four castes in Indian society, which was a source of great conflict.
옛날에 티카스 되니 산지 좀 된데가 소나 되니 당가서 되니 뭐르 대소 말레스 되니 뭐 자름군 통문 대양 되니 소 말레스 되니 슬라 되니 셰르비오나 냥지오나 드바 냠리니오나 소종 약보요나 대소월에 마토바테 잠바티소 소 마레소니 된디 송바레스
And the Buddha did not recognize these distinctions. He said that is not the basis on which to differentiate people, their caste or their class. In fact, what we should be judging people by or differentiating them by is their wisdom, their compassion, their realization and their learning.
되니 상지 나랑서 어떤이 똥바 되니 송요데 되니 나랑 탐지 보여 디 진지긴디 똥바랑 거 강터랑 송바티 지슬람닌 도야 마토바 잠바 요 말이지.
Aside from taking vows and proceeding in the Dharma, there was no other path to take.
더 딘디인디 나저 담비추 차버렸더니 탁바 침보고 그 담비추 뒤통에 셨나 되니 아주 장마 되니 미르 남탐시 본 잠님인 바 마스 되니 뭐당 쪽착 되니 기 παρ라요 사마 잠님 그거니 되니 조요리.
So in terms of the Dharma and in particular the Mahayana tradition, it's important that we not just have a view of equality between all people, but also between people and animals, and this is the path in which we need to follow.
덴디엔디 되니 가서 베나 대랑 가서 덴디 담비 추 샤파 덴디 값스 되니 가서 머르 가로였나 낙보였나자 야나 가서 되니 야였나 보였나 되니 납쇼바였나 세였나 담시 냠든 좀니 담시 보식절 그거니 되니 출라 로종제야 덴디도 가서 tomba 상지 런거 투공 투제땅 텀바 덴디즈리스.
So that we Tibetans and Chinese and Westerners are gathering here and are studying the Dharma together without these differentiations and distinctions is in complete harmony and accordance with the intention of the Buddha and the spirit of the Dharma.
덴디인디 가서 담비 추고니 되니 다 고샤 바로 고샤 자야타와 덴디즈요나 답변나 가서 보바가 추이나요 되니 가서 보그 추도 ngarancho shikbo yin zini ta tindi mayin ba tini zambalang gam suyin na korancho dojong shin donken korancho nyamsilin donken tindi yin na o tini ngatsu chunda ngarancho boba ga chure ngatsu boba shikbo ma to ba zambalang ngatsu gosha jab kumen zini tindi zejin yo mare zege yo mare tan zambalang gam salayin na tini par tini gosha jab tamchi bola jin goya tindi ziri.
The idea that the Dharma is the preserve of Tibetans and doesn't belong to anybody else, or that it belongs to Tibetans and shouldn't be shared with other people, is completely unfounded. Anybody who has the desire to learn the Dharma and to practice the Dharma is equally welcome and entitled to take part in the tradition.
Tani sanji chumdende nyangan len dewi kapsa tani konga tani pe namba ni go ne pejut namba ni go ne tani koranga tani chuta maung bana tani gandhi shine semchen thamcho la gosha jab go mar go te koranga saru sung yores.
The bezinata.
Pejut.
Oh yeah. He gave two examples of the way that the Dharma would proceed in the future. The Buddha gave these examples.
Pishte kangre zena tani sanje ga songne ta pena tani jarwo ta chongba chigla tani mushikbu ta shikbu zena choko mahachang ga shikbu tani zigla tani korang la tani po mangbo tani to yores korang chikpola purjit hachang mangbo yores tani ta tangbo te zena choko te korang la po hachang mangbo yores.
So one of the examples he gave was of an extremely wealthy person, a business person, a person with a lot of wealth who also had a lot of sons.
Tani shikbo de korang po mangbo di pa de tani ta ko shiwi kapsu tani po kashi korang ga tani ta sabla tani korang ga zhongla ndege yores kashi sholokla tani chong japsa ta tani mangchi wasu sholokla tani chong japya ta leka leya ta tani ga tondakla tani song yores.
He said that when he passes away, that some of his sons will stay and look after the household, but the most of them would have to go outside and work, do business, make money.
Tani ti kapsa tani tari shikbo gabo shikbo ti ta koranga ramla yongken koranga zhongla yongken ga tani bu cheshu de sola tani ngarang ga tani gyen de so tamchi po tani tartange kyoso lala tani jaga yensi. 옛날 디 나니 테니 다른 나랑라 테니 부하장 망보요. 그래서 참아 다스탄데나 요 말했다. 이나 코소 마옹바나 코소 참아 설 립용 그래. 디 값스 코소 립용이네 그러나 테니 나랑 그 견도서 담죠 뭐. 데 코소 락라 야보 신이 고샤 잡니 코소라 짜고 딩겐테 테니 결혼sol라 요즈네. 데 테니 머식보디 테니 샤니 테니 코랑 시송어레스.
So before he died, he gave instructions to his son, who was closest to him, that in the future all of his riches and inheritance should be divided up among the greater number of sons.
Well, that's
the example or the story he told, but the meaning of it was.
다 동고마디 강레지나 드니 상지에 갔더니 다 고랑가 축송네 다 고랑 냥을 렌데죠 드니 다 드니 잡득 연세 드니 옛날 때니 고랑은 잠텔라 디값스 다 고랑가 종나 용큰 것더니 디 로마디 솔라나 데 고랑가 드니 그 웅우 것더니 추 망보더니 다 켜솔라 드니 송 잘송시
지sk 송사소
추망보 코랑 솔라드니 데 송사 송세다 교데 코랑가 다 돈바 코랑가 금든라 용근 그 로마티 솔라 데 코솔라드니 추망보 코랑가 데니 다 로망보라 교솔라 추망보 송요레.
So the Buddha said this as he was preparing to pass into nirvana. He said to his closest disciples around him, I've given you a great number of teachings, I've taught you a lot of Dharma.
예나 데니 다 하장 망보스 다롱 데니 상지의 추대 데니 년 코소 년기 데니 고급 데니 토비오 마리스.
But still, at that time, there were a lot of people who hadn't had the opportunity to hear the Dharma being preached.
이나 되니 뭐 망보 대소 탐주보 마음 바나 갈래 거소 용네 되니 고랑소 용네 되니 고랑소라양 되니 춘더 고랑소 냔게 되니 그 고급도 고소라 용거래서 마음 바나.
But he said in the future there will be people who come to hear the Dharma, and they should have the opportunity in the future to hear it as well.
되니 고소 된지도 마음 바나 고소라 고급 요비 점승강래제나 되니 상지의 손에 되니 못대서 탐주보 되니 고랑 랑거 되니 다 이연 하장 람볼로 하장 망볼라 되니 고소라 nga마 제와 nga마 나라 고소라 추망보 시안니 되니 고소라양 되니 소소고 셈거 나라 되니 사운 박착 되니 데 고소라 지거려 옛나 네르커스 다른 고소 용 되니 추년제 고거 마용으로다 마음바나 상지의 공거 되니 소소고 셈거 나라 되니 사운 답 되니 시오비 점선지 마음바나 고소 니버트 용의 춘데 되니 냥거레스.
So the important thing was to be sowing the seed in the consciousnesses of these people, so that perhaps at this point in time they might not be able to hear the Dharma or learn it, but in the future they certainly would.
다 되니 상지가 되니 콩 되니 다 냥을 낸데로 그래서 옛날 다 고랑 콩거 추대 되니 교랑 속어 다 락란 적거 연세 되니 마음비 못대 소때 고소 용디 되니 콩거 추대 인담마다 고랑 속어 락바나라 약보스 되니 스트라고 손에 되니 손바레스.
And then the Buddha said, who he was preparing to pass into nirvana, was nearing this point, and he said, so now the job is in your hands to pass the Dharma on to the future generations of people who come to, who aspire to hear it.
다 딘디인디 대랑 아초라더니 베나 머르가로에 난자 나보에 난자 세로에 난자 더니 지더니 야에 난자 보에 난자 더니 늪쇼고마에 난자 코랑 스용네 나라 출고즈네 코랑 더니 락바징킨 더니즈고나 eng아초 코랑 거 락비나라 적고 그래 eng아초 랭간제스.
So similarly today, when there are all kinds of people, Tibetan people, Chinese people, Western people who want to hear the Dharma, indeed the responsibility of today is to pass these teachings into the hands of the people who want to hear it.
Teni te pechigre, teni pe nipati kangrezena, teni sangye sone, perna, ta nyamat me, dawa me, teni karma yang me pi nerkam sammu mannak. teni zika nangla teni mambo zika teni ta koso teni lam hajan ga nyenka chimbo teni zika par teni rogona teni matsama ga lagla romme me lok tati kapsi yo mata romme me chichi menazi mena mambo teni ta pan rogo kapsa ti kapsa karte muchik lagna teni marmen teni yo nazi.
The other example that he spoke of was a future day or at some point in time where there's no moon and there's no stars and there's no sun, there is no illumination, the world is cast into darkness, and people have to walk along a path, a road in great danger with no torch or no lantern to guide their way, that if just one person standing there held a lantern in their hand,
teni pena muschik lagla ti mahachang mambuti nana muschik la korang la teni lagbag nangla marme yona teni korang marme te la teni korang lamkha yak boz lagne teni korang teni lamchang nyengkha chan teni paro la teni thon sonazi tati muti teni karishe gorezi ti romete te kone teni sala yuja goreta karishe gorezi.
So if that person who was holding the lantern managed to traverse that dangerous road and reach the end of it, what should they do? Should they put it down? What should they do with the lantern then?
Tati kapsa ngarang su samlo tangna gandhi shego sare. Garti muti korang kata ngarang lagbaga nani rummen de la tenne ngarang lamkayak pos laksong tan riksong samme te yuja goreta yana teni muti ti rumme te shersone mo jambate sola chak gores.
So, what do we think that person really should do? That having safely reached the end of this dangerous road from themselves, that they should, having reached the end of it themselves feeling happy, just put it down or cast it away, or should they pass it on to others?
Gartiti kausatini muti korang katini te lakpa nala yo ti domete teni korang paror to son sarvi jis teni sala igine teni mepa shejana teni mutsama ga samlotana ta te mi digbore ni digjagre teni zekires.
Of course, if the person who reached the end of the road were just to throw it on the ground and do no more, then of course everybody would say that person's terrible and bad and evil.
Tani ta onati kandi che gore zena tani ngaso terang di nang la yong ken ga mtsama ga zena kandi samjere zena tani ngaso tsama ga thumung de chigjer ga gone ngaso sama oti mti tani marmite jambala chak gore ma to tani thangla igine mebashina tin ga mare ze ngaso sama te sam gres.
I think everybody here tonight would definitely be of the opinion that the thing to do would be to pass the lantern on to somebody else, and certainly not to fling it on the ground and destroy it.
This thing pejapa mare te sanjie pejapa pe ni po te sanjie rang song bare ndo na la yore.
Both of those examples are not my own personal examples. They're both examples or metaphors that the Buddha spoke of himself there in the sutras.
Ta tendi endi tene ta te pere teni don te kan rezena don upo te khorang te pete gari che gari sha ke yozena teni nga cho sangji ga song la lojong che teni sangji ga song la nyamlin che ne ta nga cho Gandhi she gozare teni Gandhi shina teni ta demo tang ke bo yong sare Gandhi shina nga cho la dengmur yong sare samji teni nga cho ha go yores teni ha go yo na ta nga rang chi bo ha go ya te jamba chi la ma shen ni teni nga rang teni ta ta ji sak chi la ma shen ni teni shin ni nduna teni ta nga cho benda moschi bo ti khorang ga marme la teni khorang chi pharo la song sawi jis teni marme thang la ik ba tang teni chik baris.
So it's really the same. What this example is really saying is that it's like us. If we study the Dharma, we study how to be happy, how to alleviate our suffering, benefit from the Dharma, but then enjoying the benefits that it brings us, don't pass that teaching or knowledge onto other people, then this is exactly the same as casting the lantern onto the ground and not concerning oneself about passing it on to others.
Tendindi ta nga cho ngarang cho tini lama gwadin la tini nga cho ta sangji chu gandhi drib go sare gandhi shina tharwa thop sare gandhi shina tini khorwa na la ro sare samji tini nga cho ha goyo res goyo na tini nga cho tini goyo pa te ta janla jeng go re te nga cho wungen res.
So our responsibility is with the great kindness of our teacher, knowing how to practice the Dharma, how to achieve liberation, how to transcend samsara. With this understanding, it's our responsibility to pass that on to others.
Tendi yendi teni nga cho yewa mambo shene pena teni chi teni ta nga cho chunda chigla jin chigla mujin tendi nga cho tendi yewa mambo shena teni nga cho sangji ga kwadang gan ro res.
So if we, bearing this in mind, if we decide to discriminate against who we are going to teach the Dharma to or who we're going to share it with and who we're not, discriminating between this person and that person, then this behavior or this stance is in direct contradiction with the commandment of the Buddha.
Tene sangji ge chu ngarang so so go tene chenpo shinanda chongchong shinanda ngarang so shiyo ate nga so simsin tamche pola jinya de tene nga so rang tene lengen res.
So it's our duty, regardless of whether we only know a little Dharma or we know a lot, to pass that on to others.
Tene kyorang so go tene so go tene toptang de gang resena tene ta jayen nanda poyen nanda tene noshok mayen nanda teni muru garoye na nakboye nanda musi nanda teni kyorang so toptang de gang resena tang ngala teni sangji ge chude ngala go zeni kyorang so teni yong ne sangji ge chude lensa yongje
So having just spoken about duty, what is the right of everybody here? What is your right? Well, your right is, regardless of whether you're Tibetan or Chinese or Western or whatever your background is, whether you're a white person or a black person, etc., your right is to request the teaching of the Dharma, to say, this is what I need, to request this teaching. That is everybody's right.
Teni ti toptang de kyosola si ge trabare zena ngachu teni kyosola toptang de trabamare sanji jumden de rang de samala toptang de trayori.
And who was the grantor of this right, or who was the giver of this right? It was the Buddha and no one else.
Teni yendi ngachu maung bana penal hakang denji ge nala teni chushana teni ngachu mobayen nanja 야연난자 너쇼고마연난자 teni 탐시 용네 teni 창마가 대추 까르와 베나가서 고샤즈 야바연나다 창마라 까르와티 요레데 까르와티 렌나 대 톱탕 수술라 요레데 산지 좀는데 공바당 텀바리.
So in the future, when everybody gathers in halls, Dharma centers like this, it's the right and prerogative of everybody, regardless of their background, to and without distinction, to request teaching of the Dharma.
Tani ngazu shisuko tholasena pena merikaruina nohoyenanja tani chi sharshoko noshoko matindi ya mangbo yorisi yinda pena ngazu hakang dindi jignala yongni changma ndikchawini kavna changman ramnimri ti thola yo kage mare.
So in everyday society, of course, there are so many distinctions and differentiations between all kinds of different people. But when we gather in a Dharma space like this, in an assembly hall or a shrine, then none of those differences or distinctions should make any difference whatsoever. And this is the equality that the Buddha speaks of.
Tani jamnim ni pa de kan le na namba sanji pa nangla tani gewa murgewa tani le jimje zene pe na nga cho yarkub ko tani chu chhamtawa tani go tani to ta ndri shina gewa re ndri shina digbare on ndri shina yagbo yong gore ndri shina digbo yong gore zene tani korang ko tani sadun tawa tani zo tani talla phab yore gewa ch murgewa ch tawa tani zo zawa tani le jimre tani zo yore.
What we just spoke about, the first kind of equality, the equality of everybody gathering in a Dharma space together, was the first kind of equality. The second kind of equality is the equality that exists in society in terms of laws that lay out what kind of behavior is virtuous, what kind of behavior is not virtuous, what kind of behavior will bring good results, bad results.
Tani lejimri ti thola tani soso rang tani lejimri thola situng yakboshi tani gewa jib tani yakboshi na perna nangba la lojong shenken na tani korang deva chan lan jore higher lan jore ten jawaz ke yishi chulgla tani lojong shenken zina tani korang higher lan jore muslim ke tani te chula lojong shenken zina korang higher lan jore chulu sidang sidang korang gewa jimken tani jam tamchi bola pamba dumkun kum musgina sina teni te korang ta higher land ona da dewa jalan ona da tendro re ma to pa te nga so chulu khashis dewa jalan re khashin ro mare ji tin ewa yo mare.
So in terms of the principle of cause and effect, this applies to everybody equally, regardless of their religious view and their idea of where they're going to pass into after they die, whether that be heaven or pure land or.
Tani karti li jimde tela tani tsung yakbo mashini tani digba murgiwa tani shinana tani nambala lojong shenken zigina tani ta higher land ro thab ko mare dewa jala che thab ko mare ten jawaz ko chulu jamba ina tani thab ko mare te saman ram nimri.
So regardless of what one's religious faith is, if they don't adhere to the law of cause and effect as it pertains to their religious tradition, whether it be a Buddhist and their idea of what results their virtuous behavior will bring, or a Christian who adheres to their particular idea of good behavior and the results that that will bring, then the result is ultimately the same.
대연 사태 때니 남바 상지바 다와인나는 배나 당아서 남바라 때니 이치시행큰 대소 상마 때니 더다 내가 잔란 로레 마토바 잠바 탐신로 말이지 근데 제가 말이지.
From the Buddhist point of view, saying that, you know, we Buddhists are going to go to Amitabha's Pure Land and everybody else is not. This is not a proper view. So when we talk about equality in terms of the law of cause and effect, then this is the second kind of equality we're talking about. And the third kind of equality that we can talk about, that the Buddha spoke about, was that everybody, regardless of their own religious tradition, has their own particular set of values. So it's important that even if you're a Buddhist and you have a Buddhist faith and the desire to practice as a Buddhist, at the same time it's very important to maintain respect of other people and their own religious faiths and traditions.
Tani karti pena mosjid ko tini khorang ko nangbala tini tapashing mundupa mundunken tini zigina tini ngaso kyo yinda manda ngaso nangbala tapashi go zini tini ze choko mari zi tini zena ngaso tini shangship senhwa ko tini shangship senhwa ko domba dan kan ro res.
If, for example, there's a person who's not interested in believing in Buddhism or who's not interested in studying Buddhism, but we force it upon them that they do so, well, this kind of behavior is in contradiction with the Bodhisattva vow.
Tani karte korang jo chulu jamba tendizla teni ta tapashing go muyin nanja yana chulu gen nanja 대다 강당 강라였나 되니 다 가서 약보연 되니 다 교수 득보래 출력대 득보래서네 되니 찍랑 되니 제초고 말에 갈때 되니잖아 되니 상가 domba 득바딜랑 간로 지니 선생아 득바딜랑 간로 그래.
And similarly, by criticizing people of other religious faiths, saying, you know, you're bad or you're inferior, insulting or disparaging people of other religious faiths, well, this is in contravention of the sixth tantric vow. Similarly, we Buddhists are all good and all those non-Buddhists are bad. This kind of way of viewing things is also not permissible. So this is the third kind of equality. So in keeping with these three kinds of equality, then people, whether they be Tibetan or Chinese or Westerner, regardless of their background, they need to proceed in accordance and in harmony with these three equalities.
티큐 인다 만다 타바 요구 인증문증 아솔라 타바 시고 딘리앙 제그마리 데니 카르티큐 타바 신근스 있나 데니 가서 디나라 예와 망보시네 데니 다직 데니 지카로 나보 딘리아 딘리앙 시그마리 티 코랑 타바 시나 시나 시나초 데 마시나 지글라양 데니 더 인다 만다 시고 데니 딘리 제그마리 데니 데 가서 짜둔지스.
So our, the basic point is, or the basic principle, is really that it's not all right for us as Buddhists to inflict or impose our views on other people who are not interested in taking them on. Similarly, among those of us who do have Buddhist faith, to engage in all kinds of barrier making and discrimination and distinctions among Buddhists themselves is similarly not okay.
대인비 김선지 되는가서 보크추 타와이나 되는가서 잠발랑가 너블라이나자 잠발랑가 샬라이나자 되니 보마인비 사차잠바 강당 강란조나 되는가서 사네 같으니 뭐 거랑서 같으니 다바데라 되니 메바 거랑서라 진족 제거래서 가서 시 고거래 되는가서 짜둔데.
So it's a basic duty of Buddhists to be respectful of the religious tradition and beliefs of other people around us in the societies in which we live.
Tani karte koranso tani ramu gone tani ta tabashin tani yonana tani ngaso tinala chik tinala yong chok chik tinala yong mechok tani yewa kage meba tani changmala ngaso gapsi jego ore teya ngaso zadun chigris.
Again, it's our basic duty to welcome all people who are interested or who aspire to learn the Dharma. It's not okay to be partial in terms of who we welcome and who we don't. Everybody needs to be welcomed similarly.
Tani tenji insarti tani terang tawala ina ngaso dinala tani yainare tani boyinare tani nabshokomaina chamayona ngaso gapsi yongin zibi gimsen tenjizris.
So this is the reason that tonight we welcome everyone, regardless of whether they're Chinese, Tibetan or Westerner. These principles of equality are the basic foundation of that.
Tani ramnyum chembo sum zeyate tani ngaso namba nane tani nangdun hajang kar cheshu zre tani te chama hako goris.
Everybody needs to know that these three great equalities are a very important part of Buddhism.
다 tani ngaso terang ka tani shuchet tani ta ta gonzne tani shakiyens.
And from here we will begin with tonight's teaching.
Tani tomar sosogo tani samba shangchim chokta simkit sim shangchim chokta simkit gores.
First of all, may everybody please generate in their hearts bodhicitta.
Tani shangchim chokta simkit zeyati kangrizglata zegrezena dondag ni changore chaki ni ogores.
In order to do this, in order to generate bodhicitta, there are two conditions.
Tani chaki ni the kangrezena dambote ngaso terang de la chujia yongwi tini chujiwi tini yong chujiwi tini muirte kangrezena tani ngaso simchin tamchela nge panba chegeyen simchin tamchela tini pantoya ga lekaz tini nge legeyen simchin tamchela dungurme ya tini lekaz tini nge legeyen samne dondak tambote chakin tambote teo gore mangjing omate teres.
So the basic foundation of the first condition is that we proceed with the aspiration, the motivation of being here tonight, that we are able to, or we aspire to, benefit all beings, that all beings obtain happiness and that all beings find relief from suffering.
Tani simchin tamchela tani to pan drubzena tangacho tartangacho lati tindi niba chimbo yo mare ngacho chila yo mare.
In terms of benefiting all beings, well, perhaps at the moment our capacity to do so is not particularly great.
Tani ngacho lati tindi niba mena tangacho garipche go rezena.
And if we don't have this capacity, well, then what do we need to do? What should we do?
Tani ngacho tambo ta ngarang sangina tani ngarang ka simchim mambola pantosare deindi nga sangji ta ngarang ka sangji drip ka yin samje ko samba teo go res.
We need to fervently make the aspiration that we achieve Buddhahood, and we can achieve Buddhahood in order to benefit all beings.
Tani shangship sim zia de nga zo kha tani shadna hajang ka lesla bores.
Of course, it's very easy to just say bodhicitta.
Tsuk ni ma to yo mare taringe kona sha pateri tsuk ni ma to yo mare hajang lesla bores.
It's just a one word. It's very easy to pronounce, a few syllables.
Yena nga zo uni tane khayu lagayo ko tone nyamlin shi guna ti hajang ka lesla bo mare.
But in actual fact, to put it into practice, to actually practice bodhicitta is something quite entirely less easy.
Te lesla bo mare ta yena nga zo karti lochik semchik tone tene te shawati drimna tene tsawani mandrya tindi yang mare.
Even though it is not easy, even though it is difficult, if we devote ourselves to this single-mindedly, then it is not something that is beyond us either.
Tene nga zo jangmu shadna se yana nguni shadna nga zo muschik matse nangla tene shangchip ko sem ti gomba gomya tele karchewa ga shawa jan chikchi yo mare.
To really to speak to the heart of the matter, apart from meditation on bodhicitta and practicing bodhicitta, there is nothing more important in our lifetimes.
Tani suso samlo tana nga zo masin di nangla tani nguni tane dondang damba tang tani hajang ga rentang yo ba da gang re samne samlo tana ta nga chu ndri sinin zumu chuksa tindi rakgona hajang khak bores rak mares.
In fact, if we try to identify something in our lifetimes that's more important than working on cultivating bodhicitta, it's extremely difficult to identify anything.
Teni nga zo dirib jogiba, dirib jidunba, teni to dirib jirgaba, teni ga nangla nga zo mamangbo zika chaparta nipshuk mago suun shisa, mamangbo zika samlo tangna, teni nga zo demo tang kebo ziyate, teni ta ngubo nani teni yongre samne shuru ngubo longshu nani yongre ta pamjur yarji tangore samne teni mese muyirti tere samne mambo zක teni kha shayang shari yige tebyang mambo chayore te tsama teni basu yang share.
In the West, from the 17th to the 19th centuries in particular, there was a great feeling, a very popular idea and sentiment that the way for us to achieve happiness was through material ends. And indeed, many books have been written about this. So much has been spoken about it. The idea that happiness is to be obtained through the material world.
Tani tika sangaso teni sambatela teni kayo mareze maybe Jameson chireze na tika sangaso zambolong ka shar nub tsama horworeze tengaso girje mambo yo mareze maybe kapsa teni ngaso teni yona ta ngaso ke boyon sare samne teni samre girje longsho tela ngaso teni chaji mado pamjola chaji yo mare chaji meti teni ngaso teni to pamjol yona ta ngaso demo ke boyon sare samne teni monam ji teni samgare te kayo mare te samlo well,
of course, this kind of idea was completely understandable in a situation where these kinds of ideas and this kind of vision is unrealized, that people don't have familiarity with what that state would actually be like. Then this kind of idea that happiness could or should be obtained through these means is reasonable or understandable.
Tadeni ngato terang dirumnya sesahci bagan nangla yongni ta shir tana tani pamjur ndosoy na tendi getini hachang ke karchim botang rantang damba tendi wa mahim bati shingkhang ke moni ores moni geti shindus
shingkin sure
moni shingkhang ngi rambal jin to shakri.
Oh yeah. Now, in the 21st century, turning back and looking back on history as it has unfolded, there are two kinds of people, or two people who know that this kind of endeavor, the energy and endeavor that was put into economic development and achieving happiness through the material world, in fact, is not that important, or is in fact not to be valued in such a way. Oh, okay. So one of the one of the people who knew this was in fact the Buddha, who knew it over 2,000 years ago. And then the second kind of, or the second person who also knew or realized the futility of this kind of endeavor was in fact not actually one individual, but many, many people. For the sake of convenience, Khenpo speaks about it in terms of one person, but is in actual fact those people in the West who are extremely well off, who are extremely fortunate, who are extremely rich. And likewise, it's not just now people from the West who have gained this realization, but increasingly people all over the place, people in the East too. Gradually, more people are coming to a similar realization. And except for these two people, or the Buddha and all of those others, there are still lots of people who haven't come to this realization. Lots of people who really don't know the futility of this kind of lifestyle. In fact, there are lots of people who still very much strive towards obtaining lots of wealth, a car, a great big house. But those people who have already arrived there, those people already have these things, a big fancy car and a fancy house as well. Many of them are able to, having arrived, turn and look back with some kind of perspective. So even though now looking back 250 years after the Industrial Revolution and all of the effort and struggle and work and toil that people have invested over the years subsequent, looking back on it to see whether it has generated happiness, whether happiness has occurred as a result of this.
니트고 말이 럭트고 말이.
So, with the exception of those people who have, been able to obtain a particular standard of affluence and are able to look back with this perspective and appreciate the lack of value in this kind of existence, there are really still so many people who are striving and struggling and really orienting themselves to this kind of these objectives.
Tani kaja tinrade ngaso lo nigya kong lo samja kong la shanana tani chama yichi maris.
If we were to have said this, that there is in fact little value in this kind of vision, in these kind of values, if we were to have said this 200 or 300 years ago, then nobody would have believed it.
Tani terang ngaso kaja tinri shana mamambus ko te re samne te koranso te semla te re samne kelen rores.
But today, when we say this, there are in fact many people who realize the truth of this kind of insight. Still, really, in terms whether there are a lot of people who accept this, perhaps there still aren't a lot of people who accept it, but gradually there will be more and more people who come to view this as an accurate assessment or evaluation of the state of things. Yeah, and the point that we come to understanding this is when we've obtained this big car and when we've obtained this fancy house, then we're at a point where we are able to appreciate this insight. However, nevertheless, this life of ours is extremely short. When given the shortness of our lives, we don't, in fact, have so much time if we're going to be doing a bit of this over here, doing a bit of that over there, pursuing this path for a while, then changing to that path, engaging or indulging in all kinds of choices. We actually don't have that much time to be doing this. So it's very important that we choose one path and that we proceed in that path. And what is that one path that we should follow? What is that one path that will bring us happiness, bring happiness to ourselves, and bring happiness to others? That path is the generation, the meditation on bodhicitta. And that's the reason why today we are going to talk about bodhicitta. So given that generating bodhicitta, given that bodhicitta is in fact so important, what we're going to talk about tonight is how to practice meditation on bodhicitta. In terms of talking about the method of meditation, it's not something that I've cooked up in my own mind and fabricated myself. Perhaps you might think that if I tell you about, or if I teach you about this method of meditation tonight without basing it on a scripture or a written teaching, you might think that it is in fact something that I have made up myself, but this is not the case.
Tani kangsha karizina nge ngaranga lamadang, tani lamaga lamadang. O tani shini ngaso lo tongcha nita ngabja nangla, tani harshok tani jartong chamba mambo koso nyamyungte.
So what I am talking about, what I am teaching you tonight is the teaching and experience of my teacher and my teacher's teacher and my teacher's teacher's teacher, and in fact a lineage of teachings that goes back 2,500 years to the Buddha. When we talk of bodhicitta, it's such a mighty and glorious thing. Where we are presently, there seems and in fact is a great distance between this really wonderful and mighty qualities and our present state. However, notwithstanding this, if we think, oh, well, if it's that difficult, then if it's that difficult to obtain, I'm never going to get there, it's so far away from me, well, I'm not going to practice it. In fact, this is something that we absolutely must not think. If we think that it is so far away from us, it's something we're never going to be able to obtain or we're never going to be able to cultivate, this is in fact a very lazy attitude, and not just a lazy attitude, but also an attitude of quite some self-inferiority. And it's really manifesting almost an inferiority complex that. And if we really think like this, then not only are we not going to be able to achieve the generation of bodhicitta, we really won't be able to do anything in life.
So what
we do need to think is that even though it is difficult, it is a difficult goal, it is a difficult objective to commit ourselves to, we need to really generate confidence in the knowledge that there have been hundreds and thousands of people who have gone before us who have managed to attain this and who have managed to generate bodhicitta. And what we do need to think, how we do need to cast our aspiration is that from this day onward, I am going to benefit all beings being people, being animals, being all all sentient beings, regardless of their religious belief or their caste or their background or creed, etc., all living beings, similarly and likewise, I am going to be of benefit to.
다 든지 그 삼로 때 가서 당럽 금머즈라 삼로 배배잖아 할리바 각보래지 임비 김성 강래지나 나랑 저거 때니다 롭자 충름 롭자 장름 더니 롭자 첨보래 또 참아가 나랑가 저거 로소 더니 냠스뇽 대야가 로소티 망치와 티나라 가리자게 오래지나 나랑 랑그더니 굴무망보 락탑 나랑 랑약보 용야 더니 나랑 랑데모치 보용야 든지 딱딱랑가 저거 로종 제게 오래지 든지 인디 든지 그 값은 가서 로소티 든지 연 차디 더니 네 나랑 파르 지앙네 네 심진라 판바드고 든지 그 삼로티 가서랑 코르고나 때즈 각보요래.
Why is in fact the idea that we are going to benefit all beings quite difficult, in fact extremely difficult for people in this modern age to really generate and commit themselves to? The reason is that from primary school through to high school and beyond, we're really inculcated with the idea that our lives should be about benefiting ourselves, whether it be succeeding in our careers or getting lots of money. And then the idea that we should put this all aside, put our self-interests and our own goals aside and work for the sake of others is in fact something with quite some degree of difficulty.
더니 가서 당럽 금머즈라 야네 더니 출룩 예와메바 더니 더니 쪽착거 더니 지때 심신거 럼바 던조다 먹 예와메바 더니 지때니 야급거 더니 양섬거 예와메바 더니 그거니 네 심신 탐주 볼랑에 반바드고 던지 삼고 레제나 더니 뭐 망부즈 그때니 심신 탐주 볼랑에 반바드고 김성가리 네네 소라 드니 반바드니 드고 김성 강레제니 때 김성 때라 상로 땅제 마토 더니 네 응원이 드니 고레 삼네 드니 삼근다 뇽뇽레스.
Really, the number of people who were able to cast the aspiration and really be able to believe that I want to or can benefit all beings regardless of their backgrounds and their distinctions, and without differentiating between humans and animals, and then among animals, between animals themselves. People who are able to do this are in fact very, very rare, very, very few.
더니 딘지 고니 김선 드니 다 김선 가레지니 따용디 더니 가서 갈때 상지 샤자다 바고 롭소 딘디즈 메나 가서 메만 보즈 그 김선 강야 하고요 말이스.
The reason with so many people really not knowing the reason why they should in fact orient themselves towards benefiting all beings, without the Buddha's teaching, in fact, it's very difficult for people to understand why.
더니 가서 김선 먹고 와이 가서티 김선데 락 녀금 만두지 때 먼예비 김선 강레제나 때 가서 묶음 통제 때니 가서 나와 두제 가서 샘그 시기디 시샤데 가서 뇽뇽 마토더니 시기요 말아 가서 묶디 때니 통통 마통 통금 만두 가서 나와디 때니 다 뇽뇽 마토 바더니 다 고요 말에 때니 가서 샘데가 디 지팅 것들이 또 로지 뇽뇽 마토더니 시기요 말에 디 뇽뇽 티낭라더니 가서 김선 강레지나 가서 김선 녀게요 말에 많이비 김선데 가서 시샤만 보서 메시비 김선지레스.
So the reason that we're not able, or many people are not able to understand why they should benefit all beings, is that everyone, or really everyone, is extremely constrained by what they are able to know. They're constrained by the limits of what their eyes can tell them and their ears can tell them and what their brains are able to concern. In fact, what they can understand are just patches here and there on a greater map. They're unable to, of their own selves, obtain an understanding of the reason for why they should be benefiting all beings.
때는 아주 상심 그 셈제야데 강레제나 디 상심 그 셈텔라 때니 내가 알아서 삼로라 장조 땅고 그랬어.
장족스나.
제방.
오야. 술을 드니 제방 땅고.
삼로 장조 땅고 그랬어.
Oh yeah. So what we really need to do is liberate our own minds, our own thoughts on this matter.
Tani gandhi changro tango orizina ta nga yenchula nga su chama te ngara rang ton ta la samlo tangne tani nga demo gandhi yo nga kibo gandhi yo tani samlo tangare ta nga yenchula demo kibo
Yeah.
ngara rang demo ngara rang kibo tani yongya ga ton la tani nga su samlo tangare
Samgayuri.
te nga su ta nga yenchu tani chang samgayores.
Oh, okay. Previously, I thought solely about my own happiness and about my own success. That is what I did in the past.
Tani ta panchoni nga so tani te par jang ta panchoni nga so ta rangyang demo kyopo yung go re te ya jamba tamche pon tani demo kyopo yung go re samne tani nga so mo yin na ja chokcha yin na ja tani tamche pola demo kyopo yung ya dongda la tani samlo tango re te la nga so nangba ga chani shan te la samlo jangro je gre.
But from here on in, even though, yes, I do require my own measure of well-being and happiness, nevertheless, I'm going to work for the benefit of all beings, for their happiness and for their well-being. Well, this is what we mean by Buddhist liberation, or liberation in Buddhism.
다 딘지 그때니 삼로테 가솔라 랑상 때니 요르고나 하자 각보리 요 말했다 옛나양 때네 가서 심캄 그토라 때니 용드르자야가 때니 탑시 때라 땐나 딘지 그 삼로테 가서 갈래 때니 때 삼로테 가서 셈라 때니 다 끼용 그래서 상집 그 셈데 끼용 그래서.
It's quite difficult for us all of one sudden to be able to generate this kind of state of mind or aspiration. So what we need to do is to train our minds to develop means, strategies for being able to gradually cultivate this aspiration and quality.
다 딘지 그 탑시대 가서 때니 뭐 그추고 나라에 나더니 할리바 망보는 도지티 탑시대 할리바가 망보 야침보 더니 답대보 더니 장장 다든지 뭐 그추고 나라에 나더니 가서 지 영마에 나다 게르게 나 사자에 나 더니 과지에 나 강당강에 나더니 참마가 되게 추고 나라 디 탑시대 하장 망보 요레스.
Strategies or methods to train ourselves in being able to generate this kind of aspiration. There are so many in the Tibetan religious tradition. All kinds of convenient and easily practiced methods, vast methods, clever methods, regardless of, within all of the different schools and lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, teachings on this are something the Tibetan religion is very rich in. And today, what I'm going to introduce to you is of all of these different means and methods that exist, just one of them. And the method I'm going to teach you tonight is the most convenient, the most easily understood, the most easily practiced, a method that doesn't have a great deal of elaborateness, a very wonderful, convenient method that is easy to put into practice. So even though it's an extremely convenient kind of practice, if we're really able to apply ourselves to it properly, then it is an absolute guarantee that we will be able to generate bodhicitta within our mind streams. So the basis of this method that upon we need to proceed is the four immeasurables.
tela nyarji se gres.
So, in terms of the four immeasurables, the first is compassion. And what is compassion? It's the really strong and heartfelt aspiration that all living beings be free from suffering.
Teni ti nyarji re, teni chad me pa se ati kangre jena, teni ngacho ti nyarji ti pena nge apati teni dungur me pare sona, nge amati re sona, nge nduruk te re sona, teni nge boda bomo te re sona, nge chokbu te, teni sam teni changma mare je, nge simchin tamchit, teni chokchak yendanja, teni tamchit teni re sona, teni dungur me pa teni re sona, sam na, teni ta chamme re, te chamme se goya jimsen te simchin lan tayo mare, simchin chamme pare, simchin tamchit la teni samlo, teni ko samlo te par gyachimbo teni shina, teni te la chamme pa se gare, nyarji tang chamme zeni, teni ni te rago mare se, nga zo nyarji yang yen la, chamme pa yang yen pa, teni se la samlo tang go re.
And when we talk of immeasurable, what we're talking about is the fact that this aspiration needs to be cast by ourselves to all sentient beings. So our wish is not just that our own fathers or our own spouses or children or loved ones obtain this liberation from suffering and great happiness. No, it's the desire, it's the aspiration that all living beings obtain this great result. So when we talk of the immeasurable nature of the four immeasurables and compassion, there's absolutely no contradiction between them. They go completely together.
Teni nga zo pena chamme pa maim ba de kan dizela se resena, ta pena nga zo bonja bo teni dizela samlo tana ne, tangi apate teni ta demo ke bore sona sam. nge amata demo ke pore sona samjendao da tendizila je yo res.
So what would be the opposite of immeasurable? I suppose measurable. That would be the idea or the hope, the wish that my own father obtains great happiness and comfort and well-being, or my own mother obtains this. This would be a partial kind of practice or aspiration.
Teni gyanja oyinana teni ta apata amayang samgreta telegang teni ngi pudo yang pozere sona ngi pomo de teni te dungur me padre sona samni teni samgreta te samme pazega mare te chatam je patindi rezi nyarji te.
So that last aspiration that one's own mother and father be well and be happy, Kempo was talking about this being a Tibetan version of a compromised version of a compromised aspiration. Perhaps a Chinese person who was being non-immeasurable in their aspiration would be wishing for the well-being and happiness of their own sons or daughters.
Teni gatson nushongja yendange hajang sarbo hako meda dange 아파다 아마당이 보다 본모양 삼고요지리 뒤돌랑이 큐도 약보레 소나 이 릴리드 데니 등을 메바틴들이 소나 삼나 데 사담지 바레스.
So even though Kempo doesn't have a great familiarity with the partialities of Western people, he thinks that it might be, in addition to wishing their own mother and father are well and happy, and in addition to wishing the same for their own children, they also wish the same for their own dog.
다들 가서 수소가 강 다량자 배나 가서 아파 아마인 난자 나라서 보인 난자 되는 가서 키워다 릴리인 난자 대 정말 심신이 가서 강라 가나요 초콜릿.
Of course, all of these people, all of these subjects, whether they be our parents or our children or our pets, etc. Yes, of course, they're all living beings, and they are all people and things we love and like.
강tar tini dindig nyarji ti tini ta nga zo hajang ka chat chungchung kyabgya chungchung zere tini ti pap garni ti chat ti pap garni semchen tamchu samji gore matong nge apa ama chigbo samnang jigyo mare tini nge bodang bomo samnang jigyo mare tini nge kyodang tini ta jimu tini samnang jigyo mare semchen tamchu dungmerdang meba tini zere na samna tini ta zo tila tsam meba tini zegres.
So even though we of course we like and love and feel great attachment to our parents and our children, our dogs, etc. This is a very restricted, a limited, a small kind of aspiration. And what we need to do is to make that aspiration bigger, much more vast, so that it extends to all living beings, in the hope, in the great wish that they be free from suffering.
니바데 강레즈나 샴바레즈 샴바즈야데 강레즈레즈 심친 탐쳔 어야 더니 데와당 담바 다타링 아서 공도 등거 메나제나 향지레 더니 참마 데모다 께보다 아더니 아서 베나 출루궁니 샤나 아서 남바yen나자 예시 추바yen나자 더니 무슬림 그 추바yen나자 더니 아서 하메 나와다 우수바yen나자 더니 지금 방바가 돈이 머리 방바 남보제나 새로제나 가로제나 자 더니 심진 탐셔대 용수 조바대 데모 께보 던지레소나 삼니더니다 코랑가 셈거 땅니 더니 삼나 더니 데라 데 샴바 참미 더니제 그래서.
So the first of the four immeasurables was compassion. The second, loving kindness, is, well, the wish or the aspiration of compassion is that all living beings be without suffering, and the aspiration behind loving kindness is that all living beings, regardless of their class or creed or skin color, etc., all living beings have happiness and the causes for happiness. This is the aspiration of loving kindness.
데니테 니바레 다스바 가와 참베제야티 간리즈레제남 페나 남긴이나 티니 나랑초 당아초 데 나랑초 지 녜산자 본자 보모자 파만자 틴디슬라 데모키 보요나 나초 가 데니 뭐 잠바슬라 데모키 보요나 나초 지 가양 머가 드양 머그 갑갑스 따로 뭐 잠발라 티니 데모키 보요나 나초 셈가나라 머가야 틴디 용거레지 남긴 나초 틴디즈레.
And then the third of the four immeasurables is joy, or is yes. And what we're talking about here is
ngacho namgin ina ngacho muziate kandizereena pena ngacho soso rang te apa ama ina ta pubumo ina te tisola demo ki poyona ngacho ga tani jamba sola demo ki poyona ngacho jimurga ta tarung kapkap스 tani jambala demo ki poyona ngacho semganala murgawa tindi yongoreze namgin ngacho muziate tindizres.
Our general state of being is that we wish happiness and well-being for those who are close to us, and for those who aren't, have, well, indifference, or even in some cases a desire for them not to have happiness and well-being.
Tani ta panchuni tani zu mayim ba tani nga zo rang su su rang pama bogu yin na ja te mayim bi mo jamba yin na ja mus tang slayan tani demo tang kebo tani yona dele jan de perna stan ja zong ja tani nga zo chok chak shan ja shin ja tani zu gin na korang la demo kebo tani yona sem kana la gamu yone o ta korang la yabu yong ndo tani te korang tan tani mun tani korang demo kebo yona tani samni sem kana ni tani sem So
what joy is the wish that all people, regardless of whether they're those the ones close to us, our relatives and friends, or they're people that we don't know or don't like, it's the wish that all people, regardless of who they are, or all beings, including animals of all different shapes and sizes and everything else, that they be well, obtain happiness, do well. This fervent wish is what we refer to when we speak of the immeasurable of joy.
Teni te sambare ta jepati tangyum zegre teni tangyum zeyati penanga so teni gawa inna de shamba inna teni simchin tamche polan jamnyum gugoni simchin tamche teni ta dewa dang damba dang teni dungri inna ta simchin tamche dungur mepa samni teni par chamnyum gugoni shogri mepa gugoni teni samna teni tela tangyum zegre tangyum chame zegre.
And when we speak of the fourth immeasurable of equanimity, what we're talking about is the great wish that all people, with utterly no partiality whatsoever, all living beings, in fact, be well, be happy, be free from suffering. This is what we talk about with the fourth immeasurable.
다 지부데라 코스 소소라더니 랑랑거더니 곰르 더니 또 용더실르 먼저와 지요레스.
And with these four immeasurables, we have four different kinds of meditational practice or method.
더니 티 지부디 나네 조 치슈디 하정거 가치슈디 강레제나 더니 냥진데레 냥진데 요소나 잠바탄제 요용 거레.
And within these four methods, the most important of them all is that of compassion. If we can accomplish this practice, then all of the others will also ripen as a matter of course.
다 던지엔디 가서 대랑 가서 공력 지부디 시작하면서 티나네 냥지 공력 지부디 시작해요.
So today we're not going to talk about all four of the practices. We're going to focus on the practice of the meditation on compassion.
Dani ta nyangji gomsar ti nani dani gareje na ta ngaso gomluk nyangji gomluk la gomluk mambu yore ta ina ngaso dani nyangma na la pe na rinjin jime langba zianda ta dani je patr rembo che zianda khongso dani nyamlin nyamnyung.
So within the different practices on compassion, the different meditations on compassion, of which there are many, tonight we're going to focus on the teachings within the lineage of Palchu Rinpoche.
쪽착 잠바초라 고소라 등물 간디 누 땡아서 하고야 돼 하정 가르침 보레스.
So what's really important to start off with this is that we have an understanding of what other living beings, what the nature of their suffering is, how they suffer. It's very important that we have an understanding of this.
땡아초 mmangbo 지금 랑그 등월때 하고 요래 마도 봐. 랑그 등월때 공컨때 하정 뉴뉴레스.
A lot of people have a fairly clear idea of their own suffering, but don't have much understanding or insight into the suffering of others.
Perna shugbu yinna, shugbu yinna, teni koranga orwu chog dungmurte kantrigen, parchirga hako mare, hako na hako kante nyonyong ma toyo mare.
For example, a rich person, a person with great wealth, probably has not much idea of the suffering of poor people, or those who do have an understanding of it are probably very few indeed.
Tani danga su shusuko tola yinna pena shusuko tola teni mo toptang yongken, wangcha yongken, tenjizi yinna, tani koranga shusuko tola toptang menken, wangcha menken ke mo tosoko dungmur kantrigen, te koranga parchir hako mare.
And similarly, those in society with position and power and influence probably have very little understanding of those in society who are powerless and without privilege and all kinds of prerogatives that those in power enjoy.
Teni ngason roa mir shedang la teni samlo tana ngaso mo namji dungmurte matok ba ngaso stokchak donro da teso dungmurte kandiyen ngaso hayang ko mare ngaso samlo yang tang mare.
And in terms of humans, in fact, we have very little understanding of the suffering of animals, what the nature of their suffering is. We don't understand it, and we don't think about it in many situations very often.
다른 가서 삼로 먹당와 잠도 맞듯 되니 가서 르비 종르크 토네 종망보 즈네 되니 쪽착대 솔라 코나 고솔라 등물이요 말이지네 되니 샹금 페르나 너쇼콘 산이르 바바 디카 과랑소 되니 양샤바 쇼어지 로지기 토라 되니 망보요레.
So not only do we not think about the suffering of animals, but humans have even written all kinds of treatises that deny the suffering of animals, including, for example, things that were written by the philosopher Descartes, etc.
Tani ngaso roa mo namji chokchak nam ge dungar hamoko, tani mo shigbo namji changbo oro namji dungar hamoko, 等你뭐 왕차 용건 저거 왕차 매바 저거等你 등물대 하마고와 띠토네等你알아 졸란 잠님 마임 바당等你 등물 만보 띠토네 숑어레스.
And in fact, the source of great suffering is that the very fact that humans don't know or understand the suffering of animals, that those with all kinds of power and privileges don't understand the nature of the suffering of those people who don't, that the wealthy and very affluent don't understand the suffering of those who are in poverty.
다 든지 엔딩아 좀뭐 식부즈겠나 오르고 남기 등을 강대gen 그런 거 만보 삼로 당야대 하정 그 가르침 보랬더니 왕차 용큰 톱탕 용큰 든지겠나 더니 수속고 돌아 왕차 멤바 톱탕 멤바 문냠총대 저거더니 등을 강인 대 그런 거 삼로 당야대 가르침 보래 아전 로아 미르라 있나 더니 가서 멀리 냠총와 그더니 럼바치고 마와 그더니 등조다 대서 등을 강인라 삼로 만보 당야 대 가르침 보래.
So what's really important is that those who are extremely wealthy and affluent really think about and investigate, come to understand the nature of those who are poor. Similarly, those who have great power and influence think about and come to understand the nature of the suffering of those who don't. And that human beings, we come to understand and have insight into the suffering of animals and all of those kinds of creatures that seem to exist below us.
담도 드니셨나? 도처 드니셨나? 가서 뭐 있는자 쪽착 있는자 잠바 남기 등물라 삼로 만보 땅야테 자와 나 치슈디 데레스.
So the really essence or the core of this practice is that humans or people in positions of relative ascendance really think about and attempt to understand the suffering of others.
더니다 가서 베르나 샘신 쫓아가는 베르나 냐치긴 난자 샤 있는자 더니 잠바 같은 로즈 있는자 든지가 베르나 잠바남 같은 수사야 다베나 주 베르나 시라 야가 투자 장소 그러와 든지가 나라 용큰 그 샘신 연난자 대 파칭 가서 뭐만 보지금 통고 말했다 옛날 다가때 베나 가서 샤르쇼 다웨였나 가서 더니 듬춤 촌만 요사 같으니 총라 야菜市场 어디 나라더니 샘신 망보 더니 사야 더니 요리지 더니 너쇼라 요다면 하고 메 강터 더니 그 샘신 찍라 더니 가서 언니 그 따니 더니 삼로 당고 그래서.
So what's important is that we obtain knowledge through our own personal experience, with our own eyes, our own personal experience, the knowledge of the suffering of other beings, whether it be a bird or a fish or those animals who are facing death in the slaughterhouse or in the different markets and things like that. Kempel's not sure about the situation in the West, but certainly in China this is the case. It's very important that people with their own eyes come to face this suffering and gain an understanding of it.
더니 가서 남경 가서 간디르제나 더니 시라 나연난자 더니 초맙 종사가 나라연난자 더니 샤당 파당 냐당 대소 거소 사야가 샘신 대연나 거소 수 좀바가 더니 샘신 대소라 가서 참아가 단도 그 말이지 가서 단도 사대 강레제나 더니 네 과랑초 강서超级市场라 강서 그래 어야 超市了地拿了有把个等你下一那他们要不要么要啥等下就单独个的
In fact, we don't often want to see these things. We don't want to see the suffering pigs or fish or birds in the markets. What we do want to see, and what we do see, is the cleanly packaged meat that we find in our supermarket freezer sections.
옛날 가서 보고 되니 거치 총강세 그래超市 디나라 용큰 그때 샤데라 되니 콜라 땀깃만 보다 콜라 로지만 보여 그래 대소 가서 상마가 따고 말이 삼고 말이.
So when we encounter this cleanly and nicely packaged meat in the supermarket, we don't think much about the history, what the chain of events and circumstances that have gone into this fact of this piece of meat that we're finding in the supermarket. We don't think much about the background, about its history. So not only do we not think about it, it doesn't come to us to think about it, we also don't want to think about it. What this is, an avoidance of reality. From a Buddhist point of view, it's absolutely vital that we do think about this, that we don't avoid this reality. It's extremely vital that we see with our own eyes and don't avoid the most frightful suffering that animals in fact have to go through. So for example, the knife that pierces the stomach of the fish, or the cutting off of the bird's head, or the various other kinds of horrible methods through which pigs, for example, are killed. It's not viable. It's not okay for us to turn away and say, oh, I don't want to watch this, I don't want to see it, I like eating my meat. No, it's important that we as Dharma practitioners really come face to face and confront this suffering.
Tani tandi simchin de chochang de tani korang ta lansang tani ta mojamba ga tani sakreze tani sanna korang ta sem go tola njikchak tani lipo go tola dungur ti halipa tani tani chembo ta yungre tena korang tani juna na trosayo mare tani korang kan thamna na mannamla tani thap ko mare tani korang inda manda tani dungur chembo tani nyong ni ta tan ro gore samni ta te sem go nala sam gore.
And what we do need to think in this very moment is that this animal, that this creature, this living creature, is on the absolute cusp of being killed, and at this point must be feeling such intense terror and fright. They've got no way to escape. There's no other place that they can go to. There's no other fate for them. We really need to think about and understand, confront the terror, the sheer terror and fright of living creatures who are at this point. And at this point, when we're watching them, it's not as if we're watching a movie, it's not as if we're watching a play, we're a spectator on the side, a bystander. No, what we do need to think is, imagine if that living creature right now were me.
Ya yana garti nyand teni ngaranga apa yinna ngaranga ama yinna teni kanti do samne te samgores.
Or what if that living creature right now were my father or my mother?
Teni ngaranga apa yinna ama yinna ngarang rang yinna teni nge muschiglayang teni noban ki me muschiglayang teni momthamba lega na kangli yo marita yinna teni musjamba teni zanshi ko ni zawang ko ni teni ta ngan teni shini teni sut 직계라 접속 된디시나 다 강디연 사리 삼니 대삼고 그랬어.
다 연재 지소나 좋게 보다.
양치치샤나 간디레스나 되니 다 가르테 되니 다 나랑랑 있난자. 되니 나랑가 아파였난자 아마였난자. 되니 무잔라 노파치요 말에 무잔라 멘텀바글레카카 길레요 말이다. 이나 잠바가 되니 코랑가 되니 저 왕식거니 되니 잠보고니 다 길라 야나 냥낭라 된디시나 당가 간디연 사리 등물 간디스고 사리 삼니 대삼고 그랬어.
So really what we need to think about at this point is, regardless of whether it were me or my mother or father, whoever it was, what would I do? What would it be like at this point when a knife is about to be driven into my stomach or my head's about to be cut off? To really sympathize, empathize, to think very, very, to really attempt to understand in a very visceral way what the nature of this experience would be.
Yana Tanita, Nyayana, Shayana, Pagina, Di, Narango Puyina, Narango Pumuti Yena, Tandina, Narango Puta, Narango Pumuti, Muzala Nopa, Leka, Kakimale, Korang, Tendi Deo Capsa, the name Muzambazikati, Koranga Kela Tripsini, Nyanala Tripsini, Koba Kala Tini Tindishina, the Kandians are Samni, the Nindang Goris.
Or think or contemplate, what would it be like if that animal, that fish or that bird or were my own son or my own daughter that was about to have its stomach cut or its heart pierced or its neck stabbed? What would I do? What would that be like?
Yana, tani nyayana, shayana, the naranga chutiyana, naranga tini jum shila kondwa, oya. They are not in it. Naranga Chitty, Mozilla no Panashio Mare, Naranga Tinita, Shilan, the Mozan Sutila no Pamashina, Mozambaz Yoni, Naranga Chotini, Kitchana, Tini, Yanala Trigamna, Tini, Tindishona, the Kantian Sare, Samni, the Rangasano Tangoris.
Or, my own son or daughter, as we've just said, or even still my own dog. What if it was my own dog and someone else was to come along and just to come along and to inflict great harm in one of these terrible ways on my own dog? What would that be like? What would that feel like? What would that kind of suffering be?
Nyayana, Shayana, Simjin Tisotini, Dumur Kosola, Gandiyote, then also Hakoyungaris.
And by thinking like this and by contemplating like this, we will be able to generate an understanding of the kind of suffering that other living creatures, particularly animals, go through.
Then you samlo matana, Gandirizina, then also Jew Nyayana, Shayana, then Yarton, Chumbum, then Mambos Sakayona, Masu Mukantona, then also similar Toragao Maris, then in Damagimna.
So without doing this, without going through this kind of contemplative process, then it will be impossible for us to generate this kind of feeling. We'll continue to eat countless meals of animal flesh, and we will not be confronting the reality of the suffering that these animals go through.
That Tendi Shapi Kasatini, Tendi Sambi Kasatini, young Tenita, Rumba Nipati can some go resina, the Rumba Tambo, the Rumba Nipati can some go resina, the Ningaranga, Boyananda, Pomoyana, Naranga Apamayana, Naranga Chiananda, Ganginanda, the Korang La Samlo Tambayana, Korang and Dobachin Dokeresina, the Korang Demochi Boyon Sona, Samni. Tin dokere mautoba, then Koran Dunguriona, ko demochibo mayona samkan, Mochigan Mare, Joshashigan, Samanga, Demoyona, Nachiboyona, then is Samkin Jankaris.
So that was the first stage, and then the second stage is really to contemplate on the fact that there is absolutely no person who would wish that their own family members, parents, children, animals, etc., be inflicted with harm or suffering. There is absolutely no person who would think this way.
Then that's so that Pamayana, Buddha Bomoyana, Sainanja, then Koranso Dungur me Deva Yona Koranso Undokoyore. tani tsama dungmur mena dokyore tani ta korang chola dungmur chembo masat dungmur chung ina tani ta korang chola mena samni ta dungmur te mena ga samni tindi samgyore dewa yana tani dewa chembo masat tani dewa chung ina te korang cho yona samni tindi samgyore te nga chon roa mir tamchi ina ja chokshak tamchi ina ja tamchi jamnyumre te nga cho tsama ga tani samgyore.
And then similarly, all living creatures, without exception, desire freedom from suffering, alleviation from suffering, not even great suffering, even the smallest suffering. Nobody wants it. And in terms of happiness, not just great happiness and bliss, but also even small kinds of happiness. These are things that all living beings really long for.
Tani korang ka tindi dewa yungna sam, dungmur mena sam, tindi sam ka yoreta, yena tini mo jamba nam ki tini korang zambo goni tini ta zungni, tani korang la zambo goni tini ta simchen ka chokjet, korang ka li ka tokla, sem ka tokla, dungmur mambo tini ta parhtani, ta dungmur mambo yung chigni, ta tindi shi ka yore ma tokba, korang ka chikyang do ka mare samni ti sam gogris.
So what we need to think is that despite the fact that all living beings have absolutely no desire for suffering and every wish for happiness, that still there are people who come along and inflict them with great harm and suffering. And what we really need to really develop the understanding of in our minds is that there is absolutely no living creature who would want badness or suffering from themselves or their loved ones, and no living creature who would not similarly not want happiness for themselves or their loved ones.
Oya ta tindi yendi nga cho perna sha ta phaksa ge tani nga cho njiktum je gre ya kwantho oya te yen nan ja tani nga cho tani sha ge nga cho ya bo ge shapchi je gre ya jijing zama ga na la lu ya oya Tiso tsama tini korang ka thum ka tokla gati tiyo re zona tani shada, pakda, yakbu zhini taga ta korang ka ta mun namla tini korang ka yunga yan tini korang ka mun namla tani shejin joka yan zini tani ka tani rimo yakbu mambu tiyo ti tsama ngukor ya re zi, chikyang ka ndoko yo ma re zi korang mun namji nga sanni ngay mun namla shejin joka yan samkang ka tani shayo ma re tani ka pagayo ma re, chikyang yo ma re zi.
So when we look at the labels on canned food or on the small labels on packets of all kinds of MSG kinds of foods, flavorings and seasonings, and see that they contain animal ingredients, no, it's not this case that the animals whose parts who constitute these foodstuffs have willingly have donated their lives for the sake of these foods. It's absolutely not that case at all. All of these animals have arrived in these food forms quite unwillingly.
Tani tindishini samlo mambo tangna tani tazo ngaso jambaso tini semjen namla tani dungur mambo yoyate ngaso hakoyong gres.
So thinking like this and really working on this kind of contemplation, we will come to the understanding of the nature of the suffering of other creatures and living beings.
Tani ngaso tendro sikposiki yo mare mo nangla yenna pena ngaso ngarang so lipo detang imbi kapse tani nati nana tini ti dungur te yo chinti hako mares. Then ngarang so soso tini lila napshon wi kapse Mankan kanalan jowi kapsa tani tazo naki dungur zayate haleba dungur chimbo yimbate tazo nga chu shigres.
So it's not just about coming to understand the suffering of animals, but also about humans, human suffering, the nature of human suffering. In fact, when one has an illness or a sickness oneself, one understands the nature of that. But when they go to the hospital and see the scale of illness and sickness around them, then it's possible to gain an insight into the suffering of illness of others.
Tani ngaso tendro namla tindi samlo tang charwi jisu tani ngaso mo nangla yana tani mo orbo mo napa tani mo tani kalak tani taga te wangbo ma changyanda da tani taga mo nani nyamchung 다때서 망보 되니 요바 때서 등물이 요바가 망보 요바 때서 탐질라 삼로 당네 다 까르티 나 던지지나 간디연 사레스 되니 뭔도 나랑가 아파이나 간디인데 나랑가 보당 보모이나 간디 요사레 삼데 되니 가서 뭐가 나라야 되니 삼로 집고 땅고 그래서
So after we've done the contemplation on animals and other creatures, we need to turn our minds to humans, humans of all kinds of different predicaments and situations, those without power, those without money, those in poverty, those in all kinds of difficult and compromising situations. We need to really think, what would it be like if these people or that person were me? What would that be like? What would it be like if that person over there or that person in that situation were my own father or were my own mother? That's what we need to really work on contemplating next.
든지 거니 삼로 마땅나 가서 멋세가 나네더니 소소고 냠용 초라 대화였나다 초라 등거리였나다 든지 망보스더니 가서 par son service tini nga so langsam jinto yore te samlo matang tini mo jamba namla pe na mo jamba la nat yona zai ke mepa konje mepa tini danchik tini mambo na la mambo la tini dungur mambo sor tini shena tini nga so samala ta na la tini jamda mambo nga so zambalang ka neser mambo nyima riri la ha so ko yore ta yinda ta nga so o tini re so mambo shesong samji tini zama to ba ji yo maris.
It's really difficult for us to really take on board and keep in mind the suffering and the really difficult situations that are endured by other people, whether that be people who are sick, people without clothes, people without food, people without rights and privileges, freedoms, etc. Every day, of course, we're confronted with a great influx of information of people in difficult situations in the news, etc., but it goes one in one ear and out the other, and it's not something that we really take on. Probably, for example, in the year of 2014, the fatalities from airplanes that descended into the ocean totaled more than 1,000 people. So we see in the news, today an airplane went down and 250 people died. A few days later another one goes down and 170 people died. And we think, so many airplanes going down and so many people dying. Beyond this, we don't think much further. So really, when we are confronted with these kinds of news, what we do need to think is, what if I were among those 250 people who went down in that airplane disaster? What if I were one of those people? What would I have felt like? What would it have been like for me?
Teso sama la samlo tane teni samlo tang zapu teni tang teni shi yongdi teni nga so matsama teni dingoriena chokchak so dingoriena ha chang tang zapu teni shik chakbu teni kegres ha go yongres.
So by really dedicating ourselves to thinking about and putting ourselves in the position of others in suffering, whether it be animals or humans, and generating a really intense and visceral sense of what their suffering is like, then this is the method that we need to adopt in order to come to an understanding of the suffering of others.
Musda say na nga so mo sem ko tang de la de ni korang so tam je bo mo sem de ni samba zambu je yin ge ze ya ze na shan liang ya den di re ze de yin di de ni chama ta mambo teni mo semjin nam ko dungor mambo nyong ko ta yak bore song te driksong samri teni samkan yo marese chama o semjin namla dungor mambo teni mambo zendo ta dungor te mena samni teni samyong korese mo chama rangjin gi teni samyong korese.
So by really coming to a really deep understanding of the suffering of others, we need to view all of these people as good people. We should certainly not have some kind of idea that either these people's suffering is deserved or that they should suffer or anything like that. No, what we really need to do is cast a fervent wish that all people be free from this kind of suffering.
Te gimsan karerjana ngachu mo thamse ko to sem ko nangla nyarji ko teni nyarji chongchong so ngachu mo chamala yorese yina teni ti nyarji te ta ngachu mo mambo dungor ta teni ta mashina teni khorang chongchong shi ne ngachu sem ko nangla teni ndukure yar chimbore thop ko marese semjin chama dungor ta mashina.
Because without knowing the suffering of others and without identifying and empathizing with it, then even though everybody does possess the seed of compassion in their own hearts, without going through this practice of really, growing it and ripening it, then it's not possible for it to grow larger and grow bigger, and accordingly it's not possible to really come to an understanding of the suffering of others.
Teni ti kapsa nga so tini moina chokchak so dungor ta hale pa tang zam mo tini ha ko yong wi kapsa teni nga so mo sudang su ke na sem ko na la ta dungor te so me so na dungor te me pare so na samba dang teni chama demo re so na ke bore so na sam gi ti samba ta teni nga so semchen tamcha hajang dungor yem ba ti si song di teni ko shik cheri ro re.
And by our increasing understanding of the suffering of others and empathy with the understanding of others, then our wish for them to be free of suffering and our wish for them to enjoy happiness and obtain happiness will grow bigger and bigger and bigger.
Benanga choteni zambalong ko sacha la teni sayum gyabanrada zambalong ko sacha la teni ju nam mamba thamba gyabni teni zaji kunji me panrada teni mambo us teni yungu yore te ngacho sanjir ko nawa nala mambo ko yore ta dele kyang ngacho teni ngune ngacho sacha tela sonni tana teni ngacho chorwa jamba yo kres chorwa hachang shiktak bo teni yo kres yungres.
And so what will happen is that when we hear news of people suffering in earthquakes, etc., or through, food safety disasters, etc., that we won't view them as others, people remote from ourselves, that our feeling of compassion for them will really grow in its intensity and strength.
The Jimson Carrera Zangato Sarshoko Tony Yana, Sanjir Tony, Nawa Nalanyana, also Jimmut in the Jipchai. Yaboza hako tangza mo hako mare then also sacha tela soni mukachi tana ta hajang tang zammo hajang saruz ko re te ko wi jimsen gi then also te semla yang teni chorwa te yang manda wi jimsen te tendis.
And it's through really seeing with our own eyes, seeing live in front of us the suffering of others, not just merely hearing about it or knowing about it at a distance. It's that direct encounter with the suffering from others that will generate a quality of feeling that is quite different to simply second-hand knowledge of suffering of other beings.
Tati kapsang aso utini te semjen sama utini dungur te tini tangzam utini shiyongdi tini aso uta sem ka nangla tini jo sem ka tangni tini soso rang sem ka tangni ta semjen te so tamche pu dungur te par me pare sona samni tini kaji nime ka tini samyong gore tela tani ta nyarji zegres nyarji chamme zegres semjen tamche la samna tani ta tela nyarji chamme zegres.
So as a result of knowing and confronting and coming to understand the suffering of others, the really intense desire and wish that all of these beings be utterly free from suffering and instead enjoy every happiness, the really strong generation of this wish is what we're referring to by the fourth immeasurable of compassion.
teni te ramba ni pa tere ta ramba samba te kang re jena teni ti kap se teni to tarung teni chorwa te yar shitak bore yona teni kang sam kare jena teni ta semchin do chol thamje pola dungur mena samne ngarang ka sem ko samba jamgi yong mandu ta nge teni semchin do chol dungur te par me ba shi odomodo nge teni ta go ndu samge ti sem ti poba de yong kare te ramba samba tere poba di ke yong kare.
So that was the second stage, and then the third stage is with this really fervent understanding of the suffering of other beings. What we need to do then is to really generate the confidence and generate the conviction that I will assist or I will alleviate the suffering of other beings.
Tati kapsa nge semchin do so dungur te meba che gona gangdi shi na thapshi gangdas go ne teni dungur meba she go samne samlo tangdi teni ta sargi sona ngarang sargi shakcha ta ban rawo teni zre sona teni nge semche mangbola teni pantona yakbo to sare teni nge yindam ta ngarang njok nyer ke teni ngarang sargi go samne teni samyong gore te teni ta ramba samba tere teni ta nyarji te shangchip ko sim teni re songores.
So then this third stage is that when really generating that conviction and wish to personally benefit all living beings, we need to think about how we're actually going to do that. And we need to cast the sincere aspiration that we will achieve Buddhahood in order that we can benefit beings in this way. And when we have cast this really fervent aspiration in the third stage of this practice, then this fourth immeasurable of compassion has become bodhicitta.
Ya tatini shangship ko sem gumsar zenanda jongder shi thab zenanda te tindizri.
And this is a practice of the generation of bodhicitta.
Teni ngaso terang dina yongkhen ko changma teni ti tonla samlo yak botang teni ti gum jawya te ngaso changma la rewa yins.
So I have great hope this evening that everybody who's come can really think about these things and really put them into practice through their own meditation.
Teni ngaso namgin gandhi rezena teni ngaso perna boban ra yinna teni ngaso chumchang chuk botela ngaso la 저 샤와 람조요야 되니 겸상 찍보텔라 되니 저 나지 차지 메야 되니 그도 온데 되니 가서 라마다 잡아서 가서 겸낭라 용네 되니 지금 돈견자 되니 mambo 되니 쉐기 되니 그 릭토리오레스.
So among us Tibetans, sometimes we've got a tradition of, for the sake of our own family's happiness or for the sake of our own family's prosperity and good fortune, etc., inviting lamas and monks to come to our homes and recite the scriptures and prayers.
Tani jamunrao inna tani to namgin tani to sosochi tani shawa lamdro yoyata 총람조요야 더니 소소 어때니 저다 나지 사지 메야 딘지 돈달라 더니 소소 금방 나란조니 더니 초반버야다 더니 뿌퍼네 더니 상기라 저런 거 나라 더니 샤왈람조요야 딘지 지쇼다 더니 네 교라더니 뿌버거연 지중버거연 지셰거연 더니 파랍 그레스.
And as for Chinese, similarly, they, for the sake of their financial prosperity or the smooth runnings of their own family, good luck in life, etc., have the custom of going to the temple, offering incense before the Buddha and making a prayer, "Oh, Buddha, help me, give me all these things that I want." And as for what the Westerners do, he's not quite sure. Oh yes, but in terms of the things that the Tibetans and Chinese do, there's absolutely no meaning in any of it.
ngaso jayen nanda boyen nanda nershop bayen nanda sama jantun la samlo tang jampan la samlo tang na teni ngaro so rang ton ti 시간 적용 그래.
So really of what is of greatest essence, what is of greatest importance, regardless of whether we are Tibetan or Chinese or Westerner, is that we think about others, the benefit of others, their happiness and well-being, and not about our own selves.
Tani ngaso gyayena tani chegendu tani gyalama so tani ngaso bobaga tani chegre tani ta choba mambon cho tani chi targi po mambo le tani ti nangla yone perna ngaso marme chimcho na tani chi yen ze pantok chi yo mo tela gormo chi goze tani mambo le ne ngaso chongle ge tondala tani lenkyan mambo yores.
So Chinese and Tibetans are both alike in going through all kinds of religious practices, almost kind of like kind of doing a religious kind of business transaction in order to obtain benefits for themselves. This is of even less meaning. This is not Buddhism. It's not. It cannot be classified as Buddhism. What is Buddhism is having great belief in the law of cause and effect. So within religion there is of course the saying, and there are people who say that it's not the Buddha who's going to help us, it's us who needs to help ourselves. And so what they mean by this is by saying that praying to the Buddha has no purpose at all. Oh, and what the meaning of this is that the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha has given us teachings about how to live and how to alleviate suffering. And what our task is to do for ourselves is to apply these teachings, to follow them and do them ourselves. And beyond this, the Buddha can't do anything to help us. It's really up to ourselves to put his teachings into practice. So what the Buddhist faith is and what the Buddhist teaching really is, the core of it is that we have proper belief in the law of cause and effect. That's the first thing. And the second thing, in benefiting others, in compassion.
Tene shanship ke sem gomya te tab debun rao shenana tene tam dor diba shena tene zrezi tene ta geba tene nga so lojong she tene dodna tene kyoran so nga so tene bogyuk tene lama so tene song na la ta te haleba mambo yore te boyik shinane tere boyik mashina ya tarta nga so jamso na yayi ko tola ta sa mambo ndoze tene nga so no shokba na inji ko tola tarta na tene ta sa mambo yosare. So tonight we've given a teaching on the practice of bodhicitta, which is a very convenient meditation that everybody can apply and everybody can really work on. In addition to this, there are in the Tibetan tradition, in Tibetan language, lots and lots of practices that people can that can also be studied and that can also be practiced. They are available in Chinese. There's lots available in Chinese language and also presumably in English as well. Teni teranga nga chu shanship ko sem zenanja sabme bije zenanja teni chatchit teni samala teni jitsar song teni samala tji cheje ge yin.
So that brings to conclusion our teaching tonight on bodhicitta and the four immeasurables. thank you to everybody.
Oya teni to chamala jati laglen gateni long re teni tanga chom jingthar chama teni ngwa molom su she teni teranga cho teni chuchi jipi teni gewi chawan de la teni simchen thamche po nerkubs teni chamala teni cherangwa tang na me pa tang teni demo ke po teni yong teni thartik simchen thamche sargi gombang thoya teni rena samjeta ta ti tinda zu yongyu shirte teni nge gewan de simchen thamche la par jingin samne teni sam gore tela ngwa ze gore na teni nga chu teni gune ngwa she gore.
So having concluded the transmission, now we will dedicate the merit from tonight's teaching, so that in the short term all living beings may obtain happiness in terms of their immediate lives, be free from illness, be free from immediate obstacles, and that in an ultimate sense that they be free from suffering and obtain Buddhahood. That now we will dedicate our merit in prayer.
Sonam de tamja zubanya domne ni be dana banje je ga na je walon ba tbim zolin doa dorwa jo oma hom banzerang ba ma sa de hom oma banzerang ba ma Sada hong Oma aho Banzarangara Bama Sada hong.
Thank you.